A gym hooligan humiliated a cleaning lady in the freezing winter, leaving her feeling ashamed and humiliated. He thought no one would intervene until a quiet, elderly man with his German shepherd dog walked by. The hooligan demanded a public fight, thinking he could win easily without much effort. He didn't know that the man was a former SWAT team member who would teach him a lesson in arrogance. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're very curious. Now, let's begin. Winter held the town in a quiet fist. Wind skimmed ice from the sidewalks, and every breath came out like pale smoke, trying to escape judgment. Jack Donovan moved through that cold like a man who had learned to negotiate with pain instead of conquering it. 63 years old, he stood a shade over 6 feet with a long, compact build that looked less like a gym project and more like a tool kept sharp by years of use. His shoulders were broad but slightly sloped now, as if the weight of doors kicked in and bodies dragged to safety had finally left its signature. A weathered, fair-skinned face rode above a dark scarf, square jaw, deep-set hazel-brown eyes, and crow's feet cut by decades of squinting into trouble. His hair was iron gray, clipped short and practical, and the beard he wore was not the fashionable kind. It was a neat salt and pepper stubble that hid nothing and promised nothing. Jack dressed for function, a faded black beanie, an olive canvas coat with frayed cuffs, heavy boots that knew every kind of slush, and gloves dark as old coffee. The only thing that looked new on him was his stillness, the kind of calm that didn't come from peace, but from practice. People called it resting glare when they wanted to joke. The truth was simpler. Jack had spent 25 years as a police officer, and the last 12 of those in SWAT, where the wrong emotion at the wrong time could turn a hallway into a funeral. A botched breach years ago, an icy stairwell, a misjudged step, a hard landing, had left his right knee with a permanent complaint. It wasn't dramatic enough for a movie, just persistent enough to change a man's life. That injury had softened his speed and sharpened his patience. He didn't run toward problems anymore. He walked toward them, as if time itself had to give him room. Beside him padded Duke, and it was impossible to tell who was escorting whom. Duke was a German shepherd, 5 years old, thick through the chest, his coat a dark sable that drank in the winter light until he looked carved from smoke. A faint scar cut across his muzzle like a stitched memory, and one ear had a small notch near the tip, a detail that made him look perpetually skeptical. His eyes were amber, bright, intelligent, and unsettlingly honest, set in a face that could switch from gentle to lethal without changing expression. Duke wore a simple working harness in matte black with a sturdy handle, no flashy patches, no bragging. The dog's gait was disciplined, measured, the way soldiers walk when they're scanning without appearing to scan. Jack didn't tell strangers Duke was former K-9, because that invited questions, and he didn't tell them the dog had once been pulled from a bad situation by a friend who owed Jack a favor, because that invited pity. What mattered was that Duke listened like a monk and judged like a librarian. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture. He simply existed with the kind of self-contained authority that made bullies suddenly remember they had errands elsewhere. Jack liked to say, when someone asked if Duke was friendly, "He's polite." And Duke, as if to support the statement, would usually stare at the person's hands like he was checking for bad intentions the way some people check for stains. They rounded a corner where the old brick storefronts wore Christmas lights like tired jewelry. At the end of the block squatted a renovated building with blacked-out windows and a glossy sign that tried too hard to look expensive. Iron Dominion Fitness, members only, adults, 18+. The sign glowed cold blue against the gray afternoon, a little island of ego in a town that mostly survived on humility. Outside the front door, a scene cracked the winter hush. A mop bucket lay tipped on its side, a small fan of soapy water spreading like a guilty confession toward the gutter. A young woman in a janitor's uniform knelt to set it right, hands shaking as she tried to look smaller than she already was. Megan Parker was around 28, petite and narrow-shouldered, with pale skin that winter had turned almost translucent. Her brown hair was pulled into a messy bun that kept slipping loose, wisps clinging to her cheeks from the damp air. She had no makeup, not because she didn't care, but because exhaustion had become her routine. Dark circles sat beneath her eyes like bruises life didn't bother to apologize for. The uniform she wore was 2 sizes too big, a gray shirt and matching pants that hung from her frame, making her look like she had borrowed someone else's life for the day. Her hands were raw, knuckles red, nails cut short. When she spoke, quietly, pleadingly, her voice carried the timid carefulness of someone who had learned that volume did not equal safety. Over her stood Trent Caldwell, and Trent filled the sidewalk like a warning label. Late 30s, tall but not towering, he had the kind of physique that looked impressive in a tight shirt and unimpressive when asked to carry anything heavy. His hair was slicked back with more product than sense, black as wet oil, and his skin wore an orange-tinted tan that clashed with the winter light. A sharp nose and thin lips gave his face a permanent sneer, as if kindness had once tried to enter and been turned away at the door. He wore a fitted black jacket with a logo stitched in silver, designer jeans, and shoes too clean for a town that salted its streets. A gold chain flashed at his collar. His eyes were restless and hungry, flicking toward passing pedestrians like he was measuring them for applause. The way he stood, hips forward, chin high, was the posture of a man who had never been corrected in public and had built his personality around that luxury. Something in his past had made him allergic to feeling small. Maybe he'd been a nobody once. Maybe he'd been laughed at. Whatever it was, he had grown into the kind of adult who collected power the way some people collected shoes, needing a new pair for every insecurity. "You're going to pay for that," Trent barked, voice loud enough to bounce off brick and draw eyes. "Do you know how much that car costs to maintain? You people think you can just slosh filth everywhere like it's your personal swamp." He pointed toward the curb where a sleek sports car sat, its paint so polished it reflected the bare branches above like black glass. A few droplets of suds clung to the wheel well. If humiliation had a currency, it would have been measured in soap bubbles. Megan's shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the water, not on him. Her mouth opened and closed as if she were trying to find the right apology, one that would be accepted, one that might spare her job, one that might stop the world from stepping on her today. Jack watched from several yards away, feeling something in his chest tighten, not rage exactly, but that cold clarity he'd known on doorways and stairwells, the kind of clarity that said, "This is wrong, and wrong doesn't need permission to continue." Duke's stride shortened, the dog's head lifted, ears angling forward. His body didn't tense into aggression, it settled into readiness, a quiet switch flipping behind amber eyes. Jack's knee gave a familiar ache, an old reminder that he couldn't be the man who sprinted. Fine. He could still be the man who stood. The crowd did what crowds often do, it pretended it was not a crowd. A couple walked by faster, eyes down. A man with a coffee cup glanced, then looked away like the scene might infect him. Jack recognized the expression, fear wearing the mask of "not my business." He'd seen it in hostage situations too, in the way neighbors watched from behind curtains while someone else's life burned. Jack took a breath and started forward, boots crunching lightly on salt. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff his chest. His posture was straight and balanced, the stance of someone who had spent years learning how to hold space. Duke stayed at his left, close enough that their shadows overlapped. As Jack approached, Trent's insults ran out of steam for half a second, surprised by the sight of a man walking toward him as if the sidewalk belonged to everyone. Trent's gaze snagged on Duke, and the first crack appeared in his performance. It was subtle. Just a flicker of hesitation, a micro-step back that his pride immediately tried to erase. Jack stopped at a respectful distance, not crowding Megan, not posturing at Trent. He looked down first, not up, an intentional choice. "You hurt?" he asked Megan, voice low, even, the way a medic speaks over chaos. Megan blinked, startled by kindness arriving unannounced. Her eyes were wide and glossy, and for a moment she couldn't speak, because her body didn't know how to respond to being addressed like a human being. She shook her head quickly, then nodded, confused between physical harm and the other kind. Jack understood without needing clarification. He turned his gaze to Trent. When Jack looked at someone, it wasn't a glare. It was an assessment, calm and complete, like a report written in silence. Trent tried to smile, the kind of grin meant to belittle. "This doesn't involve you," he snapped. "Walk your dog, mind your business." Jack's lips twitched with something that wasn't quite amusement, more like the ghost of it. "It became my business when you started using your voice like a weapon," he said. He kept his tone conversational, which made the words land harder. "That's water on a tire. It washes off. She doesn't." Megan's throat tightened at that, at being defended without being made a charity case. Trent puffed up, sensing an audience. "You think you're tough because you brought a wolf?" he scoffed, jerking his chin toward Duke. "Control your animal." Duke answered without barking. He stepped forward exactly half a pace. No lunging, no teeth, just a deliberate placement of his body between Trent and Megan. It was the canine version of drawing a line on the ground. Duke's head lifted slightly, eyes locked on Trent's torso the way working dogs are trained, not on the face where lies live, but on the center where intention starts. The dog's mouth remained closed, yet a low vibration began in his chest, not a growl of panic, but a warning shaped like gravity. Trent froze. His bravado did a quick inventory of risk and found it lacking. Jack rested 2 fingers lightly on Duke's harness handle, not restraining, just signaling unity. "He is controlled," Jack said, and there was a dry edge to it, the kind of humor that shows up when someone is trying not to become angry. "He's just not impressed." A few people nearby coughed into their hands to hide smiles. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. Trent heard it. His cheeks colored under the fake tan, and the humiliation turned him sharper. "Get out of here," he hissed. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jack could have said, "I used to kick indoors for a living." He could have recited credentials like a prayer. Instead, he did something far more dangerous to a man like Trent. He made him irrelevant. Jack looked past Trent, down the street as if checking the weather. "No one owns a sidewalk," Jack said, voice calm as falling snow. Then he looked back at Trent with a softness that was almost pity. "And no one becomes strong by picking on someone who can't afford to fight back." Megan stared, breath caught, because she recognized the truth in that sentence, the way a thirsty person recognizes water. Trent's mouth opened to retort, to reclaim the stage, but the stage had shifted. Duke held his ground like a stone statue of a forgotten god. Jack's quiet certainty made Trent's loudness look childish. For the first time, Megan saw the bully not as a monster but as a man terrified of being small, and she felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not courage yet, but the first warm ember of it. Jack turned slightly toward Megan again. "Pick up your bucket," he said gently, as if giving her permission to exist upright. Megan's hands moved. The tremble didn't vanish, but it had a new rhythm now, less like fear, more like release. Trent's voice cracked as he threw one last insult into the cold, but it landed with the impact of a snowball against a furnace. Jack and Duke remained where they were, a human and a dog, standing like a simple myth, a weary guardian and his silent sentinel, reminding the street that decency still had teeth. And Megan, for one breath-long moment, felt the winter wind hit her face and realized someone was finally standing between her and the storm. Night came down like a heavy wool blanket soaked in snowmelt, muffling the town's usual noises until even the streetlights looked ashamed to be awake. The bus stop sat at the edge of the commercial strip, a thin shelter of scratched plexiglass and bent metal that did its best impersonation of mercy while the wind threaded through every gap anyway, carrying the smell of salt, diesel, and the faint metallic bite of coming ice. Megan Parker was there alone, curled onto the bench with a cardboard box hugged to her chest like a life raft. In the sodium light, her face looked paler than it had in daylight, as if the cold had stolen whatever warmth embarrassment left behind. Her eyes were swollen from crying, red at the rims, lashes clumped, cheeks streaked with drying tracks that glittered when snowflakes landed and melted. The janitorial uniform was gone. She wore a thin cardigan that should have been retired years ago, the fabric pilled and stretched at the elbows, and beneath it a long-sleeved shirt that didn't quite cover her wrists. Her hands, bare because gloves cost money and pride demands improvisation, were blotched red-purple, fingers stiff with cold. The box held the small archaeology of her working life: a dented travel mug with a chipped lid, a pair of cheap earbuds tangled like vines, a name badge still pinned to a strip of fabric, a rag folded with obsessive neatness, and a framed photo of an older woman whose smile looked practiced but sincere. Megan kept glancing at that picture the way a sailor checks the horizon, as if the face inside it might tell her whether she was about to drown. When Jack Donovan and Duke came around the corner, their footsteps were quiet, but Duke's presence arrived first. The dog moved with that unmistakable steadiness that made the air feel more organized. Jack slowed when he saw her. He did not speed up like a hero in a hurry. He approached like a man who respected the weight of other people's shame, giving it room to breathe. Under the streetlight, his age showed more. Lines at the mouth, a shadow in the eyes that suggested he'd once been the kind of young man who believed doing the right thing always came with applause. He stopped a few steps away, keeping his body angled so he wasn't looming, his hands visible, voice soft. "Miss Parker," he said, not using her first name as if familiarity were a right, but as if her identity mattered. Megan jerked in surprise and then tried to straighten, the way people do when they've been trained to appear harmless. "I'm sorry," she blurted before she even knew why she was apologizing again. The apology was automatic, like flinching. Jack's expression tightened with something that wasn't anger, more like grief with its sleeves rolled up. "You don't owe me that," he said. "You waiting on the bus?" Megan swallowed and nodded. Her voice shook when she finally got it out. "I thought if I got far enough away, it would stop feeling like today happened." She attempted a laugh, but it came out thin and cracked. Jack took in the box, the lack of gloves, the way she kept her elbows tucked close to conserve heat, the way people do when they're trying to conserve hope. Duke sat without being told, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched Megan's knee, but he didn't crowd her. He simply made himself available, as if he'd learned long ago that comfort should be offered like water, not forced like medicine. Megan's eyes drifted to the dog, and for a second, her breathing changed, slower, a fraction less panicked, because animals have a way of letting people borrow calm. Jack leaned slightly against the shelter frame, taking pressure off his right knee the way he always did without thinking, and asked, "What happened after I left?" Megan stared at the snow collecting in the corner of the shelter as if it were safer than looking at him. "They called me to the office," she said, each word placed carefully, like stepping on thin ice. "The building manager didn't even meet my eyes. He said there was a complaint, a serious incident. He said I was a liability." Her throat worked around a sob. "Liability," she repeated, tasting the absurdity of it. "I got soap on a tire. I'm a liability." Jack's jaw flexed. He had heard every excuse power uses to pretend it isn't cruelty. Megan continued, voice dropping. "He didn't say fired at first. He said terminated effective immediately, like it was a weather report. Then he asked for my badge and my keys. I asked if I could finish the shift. He said no. I asked if I could clean up my cart. He said no." She looked down at her hands. "He handed me a box and told me security would escort me if I didn't leave." The words came faster now, the dam cracking. "I've been there 2 years. I've never been late. I cover shifts. I take the worst floors because nobody wants them. I do it because I need the insurance." She lifted the framed photo slightly, not as a dramatic gesture, just because her fingers were numb and needed something to do. "My mom's on oxygen, congestive heart failure. The meds are, it's like trying to buy air in a jar." The humor that surfaced then was dark and tired, the kind of joke people make when they're standing at the edge of a cliff and trying to convince themselves the wind is funny. She always says, "We'll figure it out, honey." But she says it with that voice that means she's scared. Megan's lips trembled. "Rent is due in 5 days. I have $40-something. I was going to buy gloves with it." She glanced up at Jack for the first time, eyes shining like thawing ice. "And I keep thinking, if I'd just been faster, steadier, invisibler, none of this would have happened." Jack felt the sentence hit him like a familiar bullet. Invisible. That was the whole trick of bullies. Make the vulnerable believe their existence is the crime. He didn't tell her everything he knew about shame, because lectures are a luxury people in survival mode can't afford. Instead, he offered something simpler, presence with weight. "You weren't careless," he said. "You were targeted." Megan frowned, confused by the distinction, because the world rarely gives it to people like her. Jack's mind flicked through old scenes, a rookie officer trembling after his first shooting, a hostage staring at the floor because eye contact felt like consent, a teammate's funeral where everyone said he was a good man, like goodness should have been armor. He had lost people. He had lost parts of himself. He had learned that injustice is not just a legal problem, it's a spiritual one, the kind that rots whoever stands near it. He glanced at Duke, who was watching Megan's face with an intensity that looked almost human. "He knows," Jack murmured, half to himself. Megan blinked. "What?" Jack shook his head slightly, and the corner of his mouth twitched, trying to lift the mood without insulting the pain. "Duke's got a gift," he said. "He can smell fear, lies, and cheap cologne from a block away." That earned Megan a tiny, startled huff of laughter, more breath than sound, but it was something alive. Duke, sensing the shift, did what humans often forget to do when someone is breaking. He stayed. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his head and rested the weight of it against Megan's knee, warm through her thin pants, solid as a promise. The contact was so gentle it felt like permission. Megan's breath caught, and then the tears came again, but softer this time, less frantic, tears that carried relief rather than only humiliation. Her free hand hovered as if afraid to touch him, afraid of doing something wrong, and Duke solved the problem by nudging into her palm with the stubborn tenderness of a creature that refuses to let a person be untouchable. "Hey," Megan whispered, voice breaking. You're warm." Jack watched her fingers sink into the thick fur at Duke's neck and felt a quiet ache in his chest, the kind that comes when you witness someone being rescued from the idea that they must endure everything alone. He didn't rush to fix her situation with cash or slogans. He had learned, the hard way, that dignity is a fragile artifact. If you handle it wrong, it shatters. "Listen," he said, and his tone had that SWAT steadiness, gentle but with steel under it. "I'm not going to hand you money like you're a problem to be solved. That doesn't help. What I can do is make sure the right people see what happened and make sure the wrong people can't hide behind noise." Megan wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the tears, and then seemed to realize embarrassment was a luxury too. "Why?" she asked, the most honest question of the night. "You don't know me." Jack stared out at the street, watching snow spin under a lamp like the universe was shaking a snow globe for entertainment. "I know the type," he said quietly. "Men who build themselves by shrinking others. I've arrested them. I've watched them walk free. I'm tired of that second part." He paused, and the humor returned, not big, just enough to keep the darkness from winning. "Also," he added, nodding at her box, "if you pass out here, me and Duke are going to have to carry you and your stuff. My back's old, and he's got opinions about lifting technique." Megan snorted, a real laugh this time, surprised at the sound coming from her own mouth. Even Duke seemed pleased. His tail thumped once against the bench with a quiet, satisfied thud, like a judge stamping approved. The wind still howled, the bus still hadn't come, and Megan's problems didn't evaporate because a man and a dog showed up under a streetlight. But something shifted anyway. The cold felt slightly less personal. The night felt slightly less predatory. Megan looked down at Duke, then at Jack, and in the space between their breaths, she felt the first small, treasonous thought against despair. Maybe today wasn't proof that the world is cruel. Maybe it was proof that cruelty can be interrupted. Jack didn't promise miracles. He didn't promise vengeance. He promised presence. And in a winter town where people looked away, that was its own kind of sacred thing. The storm arrived the way old gods do, without invitation and with a temper, first as wind that worried the corners of buildings, then as snow that thickened into a white curtain, swallowing street signs and muting the world until every sound felt far away and slightly unreal. Jack Donovan walked Megan Parker to the edge of her block before she insisted, quietly, stubbornly, that she could manage the last stretch alone. She carried her cardboard box like it weighed more than the items inside it, like it held her pride, too, and she kept glancing over her shoulder the way prey checks for shadow. Under the amber streetlight, her face looked softer, not because life had been kind, but because she had finally let someone witness her fear without laughing at it. Her fingers were still tangled in Duke's fur when she said goodbye, reluctant to break contact with warmth that didn't demand payment. Jack didn't promise her revenge, not out loud, because he'd learned that revenge is a fire that often burns the wrong house. He promised her something colder and steadier, attention, action, and time. Then he turned toward the small motel where he was renting a room by the week, a place with an exhausted neon sign and an office that smelled like old carpet and microwaved regret. His right knee had been complaining since the bus stop, an ache that pulsed with each step like a metronome marking the limits of age. And he hated how the pain came with memories. The stairwell years ago, the slip, the impact, the sudden helplessness of being horizontal when seconds mattered. Duke stayed glued to his left leg as if the dog knew the weather and the mood were both turning predatory. Snow skated across the parking lot in hard, sideways streaks. The lights flickered once, twice, and the motel's shadows lengthened, stretching across the asphalt like fingers looking for a throat. Jack's instincts, honed by decades of doorways and ambush angles, tightened into that familiar, narrow focus. He scanned reflective surfaces, watched for movement behind the row of dumpsters, listened for footsteps trying to pretend they weren't footsteps. Duke's ears rotated, radar dish attentive. His amber eyes didn't dart. They pinned, steady, tracking the empty spaces where threats like to hide. Jack reached his truck, hand closing around the cold metal of the door handle, and that was when the storm seemed to hold its breath. A figure, detached from the darkness near the far end of the lot, then another, both moving with the clumsy confidence of men who believed size could substitute for skill. The first was tall and thick-necked, a human boulder in a dark hoodie. His head was shaved down to stubble, and the exposed skin along his scalp showed faint pockmarks like old scars. Tribal-style tattoos crawled up the side of his neck and disappeared beneath the collar, the kind of ink chosen to look dangerous, rather than to mean anything. His face had blunt features, wide, nose, heavy jaw, and a patchy goatee that looked like it had been grown out of spite. The second man was shorter and wirier, with a narrow, sharp face and a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. His hair was light brown and thin, stuffed under a beanie, and he kept licking his lips as if fear had dried them out. He held something heavy in his right hand, a tire iron or a wrench, low against his thigh like an ugly secret. Their eyes flicked to Duke and then to Jack, and the taller one forced a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Evening," he called, too loud, too friendly, like a salesman trying to sell a lie. Jack didn't answer with a threat. He answered with stillness. He shifted his weight subtly, bracing his bad knee without advertising weakness, and kept his voice level. "You're lost," he said. The wiry man took another step, boots crunching on ice, and the storm shoved snow into his face as if the weather itself disapproved. "We ain't lost," the wiry one muttered, trying to sound tough and failing. His eyes kept sliding to Duke's mouth, to the dog's teeth, and then away. Duke moved first, not lunging, not barking, but stepping forward into the space between Jack and the men, body squared, shoulders firm, the matte black harness handle rising like a grip on a shield. A low vibration started in his chest, not a roar, not panic, an engine idling, waiting for a command. Jack's fingers rested lightly on the harness handle, not to restrain the dog so much as to tell him, "I'm here." The taller man's grin flickered, the first hairline crack in his confidence. "Control your mutt," he snapped, and the word mutt landed like a slur, designed to poke at pride. Duke didn't flinch. He simply stared, amber eyes unblinking, like a judge who'd already heard the whole story and was unimpressed with the defendant's excuses. The wiry man tried to circle left, an attempt at flanking that would have fooled a drunk tourist. Jack's gaze tracked him smoothly. "Don't," Jack warned, quiet as snowfall, and in that single syllable lived the weight of a man who had once kicked in doors for people who couldn't save themselves. The taller man moved anyway, stepping in close with his shoulder aimed like a battering ram. Jack saw it a heartbeat early, the shift of hips, the tightening of jaw, and he tried to pivot, but the ice betrayed him. His right foot slid, and pain knifed up his knee in a bright, sick flash that stole his breath. He hit the ground hard, one hand slapping the asphalt, the cold punching through his glove. Pride followed pain like a second blow. For a moment he tasted that old helplessness, the humiliating knowledge that his body no longer always obeyed his intentions. The taller man raised his arm, metal glinting in the motel light, and Duke became a storm within the storm. Not a frenzy, not a savage blur, disciplined force. Duke drove forward with his chest and shoulders, striking the man's midsection and knocking him off balance, forcing him back 2 steps, then 3, then into the side of a parked car with a dull thud. The metal tool clattered to the ground. Duke did not go for flesh. He did not tear. He blocked, pressed, herded, using his weight and presence like a living barricade, making space for Jack to breathe and rise. The wiry man panicked and swung his wrench toward Duke's head. Jack's mind sharpened despite the knee's protest. He pushed up off the asphalt, movement economical, and stepped inside the swing, catching the attacker's wrist with his left hand and driving a short, controlled strike into the man's solar plexus with his right forearm. Enough to empty lungs, not to end lives. The wiry man folded with a wheeze, knees buckling. Jack hooked a foot behind the man's ankle and guided him down to the ground, pinning him with a knee that screamed but held. He twisted the wrist until the wrench fell, then kept pressure, voice calm and cold. "Stay down." The taller man tried to surge forward again, anger fueling him now that intimidation had failed. But Duke met him chest to chest, teeth bared without biting, the dog's growl rising just enough to promise consequences. For a second, the taller man's eyes darted, calculating escape, and Jack saw it. These weren't professionals. They were hired bulk, bribes with legs, men who did violence the way children do, messy, loud, and surprised when it hurts. "Who sent you?" Jack asked, not shouting, because control was his religion. The wiry man coughed, face red, eyes watering. "Don't know names," he rasped. "Just a guy. Tan. Slick hair. Said you needed a lesson." Duke's growl softened into a low, steady rumble, as if the dog understood the confession had weight. Jack's jaw tightened. The storm seemed to press in closer. "Get out," Jack told them, and his tone made it clear it wasn't a negotiation. He released the wiry man carefully, the way you'd release a trapped animal without getting bitten, and stepped back. Duke held his stance until the taller one scooped up his tool and dragged his partner away, slipping and cursing through the snow like two clowns fleeing a courtroom. When they vanished into the white, Jack leaned against his truck, breath coming hard, pain pulsing in his knee like a warning bell. He hated the weakness. He hated the timing. He hated that someone had tried to turn his age into an advantage for evil. Duke came to him immediately, pressing his shoulder into Jack's thigh, head tilted up, amber eyes searching his face with a question that didn't need words. "Are you still here?" Jack exhaled slowly and rested his gloved hand on the dog's neck, feeling the heat and the steady heartbeat under thick fur. "I'm fine," he lied out of habit, then corrected himself because the dog deserved truth. "I'm hurt, but I'm here." Duke's ears eased back slightly, then forward again, and he stayed close, body angled outward, guarding without being asked. Later, when Jack could put weight on his leg without seeing stars, he drove through the storm to the only place in town that still looked warm. A diner with fogged windows and a sign that read, "Morrison's Griddle" in peeling paint. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, fried onions, and survival. Behind the counter stood Hank Morrison, a man in his early 70s whose face looked carved from granite and left out in the wind. He was tall but stooped, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested his body remembered strength even if age had negotiated it down. His beard was thick and gray, trimmed short, and his hair, white and thinning, was tucked under a faded Marine Corps cap that had softened with years of use. A stiff limp pulled at his right leg when he moved, and when he set a mug on the counter, his hands bore old scars and the faint tremor of someone who'd seen too much adrenaline in a lifetime. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, took in Jack's posture, the guarded angle of his shoulders, the way Duke stayed close, and he didn't ask for a story right away. He simply nodded once, the silent greeting of one veteran recognizing another's war, even if their uniforms had been different. "Storm's ugly," Hank said, voice rough like gravel. "But it keeps the snakes indoors, usually." Jack slid onto a stool with a careful wince that he tried to hide and failed. "Not all of them," he replied. Duke settled at Jack's boots, body still, ears awake, as if the diner's warmth didn't erase the night's lesson. Hank's gaze flicked to the dog with something like respect. "Good shepherd," he muttered, not as a compliment but as an assessment. Jack took a sip of coffee and felt it burn life back into his chest. He didn't waste time. "The guy from Iron Dominion," Jack said. "Caldwell. What's his real reach?" Hank's mouth tightened and the lines around his eyes deepened into an expression of old disgust. "Trent?" Hank spat the name like it tasted bad. "He ain't just loud. Loud men are easy. He's a collector. He collects fear." Hank leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Calls it a security fee. Walks into small businesses like he owns the sidewalk, says he can't guarantee their windows won't get accidentally broken if they don't pay for his protection. He's been squeezing this block for 2 years. Folks sign contracts at his gym. Adults only, sure. But he locks them in like a trap. Cancellation fees, upgrade charges, the whole carnival." Hank's eyes narrowed. "And if you embarrass him?" "He doesn't sulk. He punishes." Jack felt the pieces click. The ambush, the threat, the public show. Hank continued, voice steady, painful in its certainty. "People tried reporting him. Paperwork disappears. Complaints get lost. He's got friends, or he's got people who like his money." Jack stared down at the coffee as if it might reveal a path forward. He thought of Megan's hands, raw and cold. He thought of Duke's head on her knee, offering comfort like it was a duty. He thought of his own knee screaming on the asphalt, a reminder that the body gets tired long before the conscience does. The realization landed with an ache deeper than bone. Evil didn't win because it was stronger. It won because good people were exhausted, and exhaustion made them look away. Jack lifted his gaze, meeting Hank's pale eyes. "I'm not looking away," Jack said quietly. Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, a small, decisive punctuation, like the old gods of winter had just heard a vow and approved of its shape. Morning didn't arrive so much as it surrendered, gray light seeping through the storm's leftovers, revealing a town dusted in fresh snow like the world had tried to start over and forgot to ask permission. Jack Donovan woke with his right knee barking its old complaint, the joint stiff and hot beneath the skin as if it remembered the asphalt with personal resentment. He sat on the edge of the motel bed, massaging the tendon with 2 careful thumbs, breathing through the ache the way he used to breathe through adrenaline. Duke watched from the floor with a steady, unblinking focus, head tilted slightly, ears forward. The dog had that look that said, "You can limp, but you cannot lie." Jack gave a quiet snort of humor. "You think you're my coach?" he murmured. Duke's tail thumped once and Jack accepted the verdict. Outside, the wind had calmed into a cold whisper, the kind that made everything feel exposed. Jack didn't go straight to Iron Dominion. He went to work first. Because he'd learned that pride wins fights, but paperwork wins wars. He drove to a print shop on a side street where the windows were steamed from heaters and old coffee. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes and a nose ring, didn't ask why Jack needed copies of public records. He simply took the flash drive and hit print like it was any other Tuesday. Jack had spent the early hours in Morrison's griddle, using the diner's spotty Wi-Fi and Hank's stubborn patience to dig through open records, business filings, consumer complaints buried in obscure forums, an old disciplinary notice from a private fitness licensing board, and, most importantly, a pattern of shell company shipments addressed to Iron Dominion that didn't match the products advertised on its glossy website. Nothing illegal was proven yet, not in a courtroom sense, but it was enough to make a liar sweat when the room went quiet. Hank Morrison insisted on helping, not with fists, but with connections. In the daylight, Hank looked even more like a weathered monument, thick gray beard trimmed short, pale blue eyes sharp as broken ice, and that stiff leg that dragged a fraction behind him when he walked, a souvenir from a long-ago blast in a place he never spoke about. He wore a heavy flannel under a denim jacket and a marine cap that seemed welded to his head by habit. Hank had the demeanor of a man who had buried friends and didn't waste words on nonsense. "You're going in alone?" he asked, sliding Jack a plate of eggs and toast he pretended not to charge for. Jack sipped black coffee and nodded. "I'm going in old," he corrected, and Hank's mouth twitched in something almost like a smile. "Old men are the worst," Hank muttered. "They know what matters." Before Jack left, Hank added one more piece to the puzzle. The crowd. "He'll want witnesses," Hank said, wiping the counter with slow, angry strokes. "That's how he feeds. He'll turn it into a show, make cool. You the villain, him the hero." Jack's gaze drifted to Duke, who lifted his head at the mention of show as if he disliked theater on principle. Let him, Jack said. A liar needs an audience. So does the truth. By noon, the streets had cleared, but the cold stayed, sharp enough to bite the inside of lungs. Iron Dominion's sign glowed smug and bright against the white day. A notice had been taped near the entrance, printed in bold letters like a proclamation. Challenge match, members only, adults. 18 plus, 2 p.m. Beneath it, someone had written in marker, "No dogs on the mat." Jack read it and exhaled through his nose. Duke sat at his heel, eyes on the door, as if the building itself smelled wrong. Inside, the gym was warm and loud, music thumping like a heartbeat that had forgotten it was supposed to be human. The air smelled of rubber mats, sweat, cologne, and something faintly chemical beneath it all, like a supplement store trying to hide a laboratory. The space had been arranged into a makeshift ring on the main floor with bright overhead lights, mirrored walls, and benches pulled close for spectators. There were no children, no parents with strollers, no high-pitched chaos, only adults with tired faces and guarded eyes. Business owners stood shoulder to shoulder in winter jackets, hands stuffed into pockets, the kind of people who worked long hours and had learned to swallow anger because anger doesn't pay bills. A woman near the front, Sarah Linwood, early 40s, watched the ring with the rigid posture of someone bracing for disappointment. She was tall and slim, almost willowy, with pale skin freckled across the bridge of her nose and dark auburn hair pulled into a tight ponytail that made her cheekbones look sharper. She wore a long charcoal coat and square-framed glasses, and her mouth sat in a line that suggested she'd spent years being polite to men who didn't deserve it. Sarah ran a small massage therapy studio 2 blocks away. Hank had told Jack she'd paid Trent's security fee for 6 months until she finally refused, and her front window had mysteriously shattered the following week. She had rebuilt her business on grit and late nights, and now she looked at the ring like she was done being afraid but not sure how to stop. Beside her stood a thick-set man with a trimmed beard and rough hands, the owner of a hardware store, his knuckles still bearing faint scars from years of work. Behind them, Roger Feldman, the building's facilities manager, hovered near the back wall. Roger was in his mid-50s, balding with a fringe of gray hair, skin shiny with anxious sweat despite the gym's cool air. His suit was wrinkled like he'd slept in it, and his wire-rimmed glasses kept slipping down his nose. Roger had the posture of a man trained by life to avoid conflict. His shoulders curled inward, his hands fidgeted with a keyring, and his eyes darted to the door every time it opened, as if expecting trouble to walk in wearing a name tag. Jack recognized him immediately as the type who let bullies thrive because fear had convinced him it was the same thing as caution. Then, Trent Caldwell arrived like a man stepping onto a stage he believed he owned. He wore a fitted athletic top in glossy black, his hair slicked back, tan glowing in a way that seemed almost aggressive under the lights. He had swapped his street jacket for a branded rash guard that clung to his chest, as if fabric could prove authority. He paced the ring with a grin and raised his arms to soak in the attention, feeding on it the way some men feed on applause when they don't know how to feed themselves. His eyes locked on Jack, and the grin sharpened. "Well, look who decided to keep playing hero," Trent announced, loud enough for the whole room. "The senior citizen with the attack dog." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd, thin, forced, the kind people make when they want to survive the moment. Jack didn't respond. He walked in calmly, wearing a simple dark thermal shirt, tactical-style pants, and boots, plain, practical, almost boring. His face was unreadable, which unsettled Trent more than insults ever could. Duke trotted beside him, harness on, amber eyes scanning. Trent pointed at the corner. "Dog stays there," he said. "No interference." Jack nodded once. "He'll stay," he replied. He guided Duke to the corner of the ring where a metal post marked the edge of the mat. "Guard," Jack said quietly. Duke sat with perfect posture, back straight, head high, eyes forward. He looked less like a pet and more like a witness sworn in by an older law. The room changed subtly with that sit. Even people who didn't like dogs felt something steady settle into the air, as if Duke's discipline made chaos harder to justify. Trent rolled his shoulders dramatically. "Let's make this interesting," he said. "You stop meddling, you apologize to me, and you walk out of here with your pride intact." Jack's eyes flicked to Roger, then to Sarah, then to the crowd of adults who had paid to be intimidated. "No," Jack said simply. The word was quiet, but it landed heavy. Trent's smile twitched. "Scared?" he taunted. Jack's mouth barely moved. "I'm tired," he corrected. "There's a difference." That got a soft, surprise sound from somewhere in the crowd, half laugh, half relief, because tired was something they understood. Trent stepped closer, lowering his voice like a man trying to make his cruelty feel intimate. "You're out of your depth," he hissed. "You don't know what I can do to people who cross me." Duke's ears angled forward, and the dog's gaze pinned Trent like a spotlight. Jack didn't flinch. "I know exactly what you do," he said. "You threaten, you squeeze, you punish, you call it strength." Trent's face reddened beneath the tan. "Enough talk," he snapped. "You wanted to prove something? Prove it." The match started without ceremony. Trent bounced on his toes, throwing flashy feints, spinning his hands as if he were performing for a camera. Jack stood still, knees slightly bent, weight balanced, careful with the bad knee but not guarded by it. Trent lunged with a sweeping kick designed to look impressive. Jack shifted back a half step and let it cut air. Trent followed with rapid punches, overcommitting, trying to overwhelm. Jack parried and slipped, moving with economy, letting Trent burn energy like a man lighting money on fire. The crowd's murmurs rose and fell like waves, adults leaning forward, their faces tense with the strange hope that maybe, for once, a bully would not be rewarded. Trent grew frustrated, his breathing louder. He threw a wild overhand right, big, angry, theatrical. Jack stepped inside the arc, caught the wrist, and rotated Trent's arm into a controlled lock. It wasn't a brutal move. It was a precise lesson, the kind taught in places where fights weren't sports. Trent's momentum betrayed him. He stumbled, and Jack guided him down to the mat with a clean takedown that ended in a pin. The gym went silent except for the thud of bodies and the hum of lights. Trent's face mashed against the mat, pride collapsing faster than his balance. He tried to wriggle free, but Jack's weight and leverage held him like truth holds a lie when it stops being entertained. "Tap," Jack said quietly, not cruel, just final. Trent grunted, panic rising. His hand slapped the mat twice. Jack released him and stepped back. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood there breathing evenly, as if he'd just finished tying his boots. Trent scrambled up, clutching his shoulder and coughing, eyes wild with humiliation. "That was," he sputtered, "that was illegal. That's not—" Jack reached into a plain leather folder he'd set at the edge of the ring and pulled out papers. The sound of paper in that quiet room was strangely loud, like a blade leaving a sheath. "This isn't about a match," Jack said, voice carrying. "This is about what you've been doing to people who were too tired to fight you." Trent sneered, trying to recover. "You have nothing," he spat. Duke chose that moment to stand, not lunging, not barking, just rising smoothly, like a judge rising to speak. The room's eyes snapped to him. Duke walked 2 steps, nose low, and stopped near a side door marked "Staff Only." He sat and stared at the door with unblinking focus, then looked back at Jack as if handing him a pointer on a map. People shifted uneasily. Some inhaled sharply, sensing the dog had found something. Trent's face drained a fraction. "Get your mud under control," he barked, voice cracking. Jack didn't look at Trent. He looked at Duke. "Show me," Jack murmured. He walked to the side door, and Duke remained seated, eyes locked, a living arrow. Jack didn't break in. He didn't kick anything. He simply tested the handle. It opened. Inside, a narrow storage area smelled of plastic tubs and powdered protein, and beneath that, a sharper chemical tang that didn't belong in a legitimate gym. Boxes were stacked neatly, labels reading nutritional supplements, but the shipping slips showed unfamiliar company names in foreign ports. Jack turned back to the crowd, holding up a slip. "These shipments," he said, voice steady, "don't match what he sells out front." Trent stepped forward, trying to block sightlines with his body, but bodies no longer mattered. People were seeing with their own eyes. Jack returned to the ring, raised a document, and addressed the adults directly. "Some of you have paid him security fees," Jack said, eyes sweeping the room. Sarah's jaw tightened. She didn't look away. "Some of you signed contracts you couldn't escape. Some of you were threatened when you said no." Roger flinched, face flushing with shame. Trent's breathing was loud now, ragged. "Lies!" he shouted. "He forged that!" Duke's head snapped toward Trent, ears sharp. Then Duke barked once, one clean, authoritative bark that cut through the noise like a gavel strike. It wasn't rage, it was punctuation. The room froze. Even Trent's mouth hung open for a second, caught mid-performance. Jack let that silence sit. "No," Jack said calmly. "That's enough talking." And in that moment, adults who had spent months swallowing fear began to remember they had voices. A man near the back muttered, "He charged me $200 a month for protection." Another said louder, "My store got vandalized after I refused." Sarah stepped forward, shoulders squared, and her voice rang clear, trembling but strong. "He broke my window," she said, and the words sounded like a door opening after years stuck shut. Trent looked around as if searching for his old audience, but the audience was turning into a jury. Jack stood beside Duke, one hand resting lightly on the harness handle, and felt the strange, aching triumph of watching fear lose its throne. He didn't know yet how the law would move, how fast it would grind, how much Trent would try to wriggle. But he knew this: the room had seen the bully pinned and then seen the dog point to the rot behind the curtain. Truth, it turned out, could come on 4 paws as easily as 2. The first real thaw did not come with sunshine. It came with sound, the click of a pen, the murmur of voices choosing truth, the hard official snap of consequences finally catching up to a man who had lived like gravity was optional. After the gym fell silent under Duke's single bark and the adults began to speak, the room turned from spectacle into testimony. Jack Donovan didn't shout orders or claim authority. He simply stood where everyone could see him, old knee aching, shoulders squared, letting people borrow his steadiness the way a cold traveler borrows a fire. Sarah Linwood stepped forward again, tall and slim in her charcoal coat, auburn ponytail tight, freckles stark against pale winter skin. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from the strain of finally saying out loud what she had swallowed for months. "He demanded cash," she said, voice sharp with contained fury. "He called it protection. After I refused, my window shattered. I paid after that because I didn't want to lose my clients. I hated myself for it." She exhaled as if releasing a weight. "I'm done hating myself." A thick-set hardware owner nodded beside her, his rough hands clenched, the trimmed beard on his jaw quivering with anger that had nowhere to hide anymore. Roger Feldman, balding, anxious, glasses sliding down his sweating nose, looked like a man being forced to meet his own reflection. He swallowed hard, then spoke with a thin, strained honesty. "I ignored complaint," he admitted. I told myself it was safer. I was wrong." His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked older than Hank Morrison, because cowardice ages a man faster than years do. Hank stood near the back, granite-faced under his marine cap, eyes pale and steady, one hand resting on the top of his cane. He did not speak much, but when he did, it was with the calm certainty of someone who had learned long ago that bullies thrive on noise and die in daylight. "You want this handled?" Hank rumbled. "Then we do it clean, we do it proper." Someone called the police, someone else, emboldened, offered their phone with recordings of threats and contracts. Jack did not rush the process. He knew how fragile a turning point could be. The law, if starved of clarity, could slip back into shadows. So he stayed, quiet, present, while people filed into lines, handed over paperwork, described dates, names, amounts. Duke remained near the staff door, sitting like a sentry carved from muscle and patience, amber eyes tracking every movement in the room. Now and then his nose lifted, pulling invisible threads of scent from the air. Jack didn't need Duke to be aggressive. He needed Duke to be undeniable. And the dog delivered that simply by being what he was, disciplined truth on 4 paws. When Trent Caldwell tried to reclaim control, it looked pathetic. His tan seemed too orange under fluorescent light, his slick hair too shiny, his voice too loud. He paced, throwing accusations that sounded like recycled lines from a cheap courtroom show. "This is harassment," he shouted. "He trespassed. He threatened my business." He pointed at Jack, then at Duke, then at the crowd, as if he could rearrange reality by pointing harder. But the room no longer belonged to his performance. It belonged to the adults he had squeezed, adults with rent, bills, aching backs, and tired eyes who had discovered that exhaustion was not the same as surrender. Trent's gaze darted to the exit once, twice, calculating escape. That was when Duke rose to his feet again, slowly, deliberately, without a bark, without a growl, just a quiet elevation of presence that made Trent's body stiffen as if his spine suddenly remembered consequences. Duke didn't move toward him. He didn't need to. He simply stood and watched, and Trent's feet stopped shuffling. Minutes later, the doors opened and the cold air rolled in like a judge entering court. Officer Daniel Mercer stepped inside with two other uniformed officers. Mercer was in his mid-40s, tall and lean, with a face made of clean angles and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a mouth used to delivering bad news. His hair was dark, cropped short, and his eyes were a calm blue-gray, the kind that didn't get impressed by loud men. He scanned the room quickly, assessing. When his gaze landed on Jack, it paused, a fraction longer than it paused on anyone else, not because he recognized a celebrity, but because he recognized a kind of quiet competence that law enforcement learns to spot. Mercer's voice was firm, professional. "We received multiple complaints regarding extortion, fraud, and assault solicitation," he said, and those words hit the room like the first crack in ice. Trent sputtered. "This is ridiculous. You can't—" Mercer raised a hand, not aggressive, just final. "Sir, step away from the crowd." Trent tried to smile, tried to charm. It looked like lipstick on a bruise. Mercer didn't smile back. "Turn around," he instructed. Trent's eyes widened, the mask slipping. "Wait, there's a misunderstanding." Mercer nodded once, almost sympathetic, the way a man is sympathetic to a mosquito right before swatting it. "We'll sort it out downtown." When the cuffs clicked onto Trent's wrists, the sound traveled through the gym with a strange holiness, metal on skin, consequence on arrogance. Trent's shoulders sagged, his eyes flashed from fury to panic to a kind of wounded disbelief, like a child finally told no by the universe itself. He twisted toward Jack. "You did this," he hissed. Jack's expression didn't change. "No," Jack said quietly. "You did." Duke exhaled, a soft huff, as if the dog agreed with the grammar of justice. The officers moved Trent toward the door, and as they passed, Duke stepped slightly forward, not to attack, not to menace, but to stand between Trent and the civilians like a living reminder. "You don't get to lash out anymore." Trent flinched and looked away. Outside, the winter air grabbed him, and the storm that had once protected his swagger now watched him leave in handcuffs. It was not a heroic scene. It was better. It was ordinary accountability. The gym emptied slowly after that, adults leaving in small clusters, talking in low voices, faces pale with adrenaline and relief. Sarah lingered near Jack, eyes bright behind her glasses. "I thought I was weak," she said, and her laugh was small and bitter. "Turns out I was just alone." Jack nodded. "Most people aren't built to fight alone," he replied. "That's not weakness. That's being human." She looked down at Duke and hesitated, then reached out. Duke didn't shove into her hand the way he had with Megan. He simply allowed the touch, calm and dignified. Sarah's shoulders eased. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog as if Duke could file the gratitude somewhere official. Hank Morrison clapped Jack once on the shoulder, careful of the knee, the gesture heavy with veteran respect. "You made the block breathe again," Hank said. Jack shook his head slightly. "They did," he corrected, nodding at the people who had finally spoken. "I just gave them cover." By late afternoon, Jack's work wasn't finished. He went with Roger Feldman to the building management office, not to intimidate, but to watch Roger do something rare: take responsibility. Roger looked like he'd aged 5 years since morning, but something in him had straightened. His suit was still wrinkled, glasses still slipping, but his voice held a steadier note. "Megan Parker," he said into the phone, "I'd like you to come in tomorrow. We need to correct a mistake." Jack listened silently, Duke lying by the door like a quiet oath. Roger hung up and stared at his desk as if expecting it to yell at him. "I should have protected her," he said, voice cracking. Jack's tone stayed level. "Then start now." The next day, the snow still clung to rooftops, but it looked less like a threat and more like a blanket. Megan arrived at the office with her shoulders drawn in, cardigan buttoned wrong from nerves, hair in the same messy bun, but her eyes different, Still tired, still cautious, yet carrying a spark that hadn't been there before. She carried no box this time. When she saw Jack in the hallway, she froze, then approached slowly as if afraid hope might vanish if she moved too fast. Duke stood and walked to her first, tail swaying in a slow, controlled rhythm. Megan's breath hitched. "Hi," she whispered to the dog, voice soft as falling snow. Duke pressed his muzzle into her palm, warm and solid. Her eyes flooded, and she blinked hard, trying to hold it together. Jack spoke gently. "You're not in trouble," he said. "You're being seen." Roger met her with an awkward, earnest seriousness. He apologized. Real apology, not the cheap kind. Then offered a reinstatement letter, a raise, and a written guarantee of schedule flexibility for her mother's appointments. He slid another envelope across the desk. Restitution arranged through a fast-moving civil claim filed by multiple tenants and business owners, backed by the evidence seized from Trent's operation. Megan's hands shook as she opened it. The amount wasn't magical wealth. It was something better, breathing room. Enough to cover medications, oxygen supplies, and overdue rent. Enough to stop choosing between food and pharmacy. Megan stared at the check as if it might dissolve. Then she covered her mouth with her hand and made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I didn't know life could do this," she said. "I thought it only takes." Jack's eyes warmed. "Life takes," he said. "People give." Megan turned toward Jack, and the gratitude in her face was so raw it almost hurt to look at. "You didn't have to," she whispered. Jack shrugged slightly, humor returning like a thin sunbeam through clouds. "My knee disagrees," he said. "It voted no. I overruled it." Megan laughed through tears. Then her gaze slid to Duke and stayed there longer. She understood, in a way words struggled to capture, that without that dog's steady presence on the sidewalk, she might have folded into silence the way snow melts into gutters, unnoticed, unnamed, gone. Duke stepped closer and placed his muzzle on the back of her hand, gentle as a blessing. Jack's voice dropped, rougher at the edges. "He didn't sign the report," he murmured, trying to make it sound like a joke and failing just enough for the truth to show. "But he witnessed everything." Megan's laugh broke into a sob, and then she did something brave. She let both happen without shame. Later, at dusk, Jack loaded his bag into his truck. Hank, Sarah, and a couple of shop owners stood nearby, not cheering, just present. Adults offering the kind of gratitude that doesn't need confetti. Megan stood a few steps apart, clutching her envelope like a fragile miracle. The winter sky blushed purple and gold behind bare trees. Jack opened the passenger door, and Duke jumped in with practiced ease, curling onto the seat with a sigh that sounded like a job well done. Jack leaned on the open door for a moment, looking at the faces, tired, relieved, hopeful, and feeling an unfamiliar ache that wasn't pain. It was meaning. He had spent years believing heroism had to be loud. Tonight it was quiet. It was a janitor no longer invisible. It was a building manager, learning courage late, but learning it anyway. It was a woman with a broken window finally speaking truth. And it was a dog who had stood between a bully and a vulnerable stranger, not because he understood money or contracts, but because he understood pack. Jack started the engine. Megan stepped forward, eyes shining. "Thank you," she said again, softer, like she was placing the words carefully in the world so they wouldn't get lost. Jack nodded once. "Pass it on," he told her. "That's how it sticks." Duke lifted his head and looked at Megan through the glass, amber eyes steady, and Megan lifted her hand in a small wave. Jack pulled away slowly, tires crunching snow, and as the truck rolled down the winter street, Duke rested his chin on the window ledge, watching the town recede. He wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder that loyalty, quiet, stubborn, unadvertised, can be the rope that keeps a person from slipping off the edge when life is slick with ice. In the quiet, after the shouting, after the paperwork, after the cold finally loosened its grip, the real miracle wasn't that a bully fell. It was that ordinary people remembered they were not alone. Jack Donovan, 63, 6', with broad, slightly sloped shoulders, a square jaw, short salt and pepper hair, a neat mustache and light stubble, and steady, dark brown eyes, carried an old knee and an older vow through the snow. And Duke, adult German Shepherd, dark sable coat, amber eyes, disciplined and calm in a black navy harness, carried something just as heavy, the courage to stand between harm and the fragile. Megan Parker, 22, petite and worn thin by winter and worry, learned that being seen can heal a person in ways money never will. And Sarah Linwood, early 40s, tall and slender, auburn ponytail, freckled pale skin, square-framed glasses, learned that speaking the truth out loud can be the first step out of fear. If God still moves in this world, sometimes he doesn't arrive with thunder. He arrives as a steady hand, a loyal dog, and a moment of mercy that refuses to look away. And that's the part that reaches into everyday life. The next time you see someone being crushed by cruelty, don't underestimate what a small act of courage can become in God's hands. A kind word, a witness who stays, a decision to tell the truth, those are seeds. And miracles often start as seeds. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs. Leave a comment with where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, and thank you so much for watching.